Evening settled over the old temple with the softness of falling ash. In the long corridor, rows of wooden pillars stood in calm silence, their shadows stretching across the floor as lantern light deepened. The first drops of rain arrived without hurry, touching the tiled roofs in faint, uneven taps. A cool draft moved through the hall, carrying the smell of wet cedar. The monk walked slowly, his bare feet making muted sounds against the polished boards. His robes swayed lightly with each step, holding the fading warmth of the day. Ahead of him, a lantern flickered in the shifting air, its thin paper panels glowing like a quiet ember. The world outside began to blur behind the veil of rain. The sound of the storm gathered itself into a soft rhythm, gentle but steady. Water slid along the gutters and pooled at the corners of the courtyard. A distant bell trembled somewhere in the valley, its tone softened by the thickening mist. The corridor absorbed these sounds as if it had always known them. He paused beside a lantern whose flames swayed with the wind. Its warmth glowed through the thin paper, casting a small circle of gold around his hands. Moths drifted in slow arcs near the light, their wings making faint, dusty taps against the frame. The monk watched them without moving, his breathing slow in the cool air. Beyond the sliding doors, the garden had become a dusk of unclear shapes. Bamboo bent gently in the wind, their dark forms swaying as if half asleep. Rain traced long, silver lines down the paper windows, blurring everything into softness. Nothing is required from you. He resumed his walk, the corridor stretching before him like a long, quiet river. Each lantern he passed sent shadows sliding behind him, shifting in calm waves. A loose board gave a soft sigh under his weight, then stilled again. The air around him felt open and unhurried, as though time itself had lowered its voice. At the far end, a half-open door revealed a glimpse of the outside, a slant of night sky, a glimmer of wet stone, rain falling through lantern light in drifting lines. The lantern nearest the doorway trembled slightly on its hook, the flame rising and bowing as the wind pressed in. The monk stepped closer, watching its reflection ripple on the damp floorboards, never settling into one shape. The door to the small tea room slid open with a soft wooden breath. Inside, the air held a gentle warmth, touched by the faint heat of a clay pot resting above a low flame. Shadows from the fire moved along the walls in slow waves, carrying the calm rhythm of something long familiar. The storm outside thickened, but here, the world felt folded into quiet. The monk stepped in and closed the door behind him, shutting out the drifting threads of rain. The wooden floor was warmer beneath his feet, holding the memory of earlier embers. A single lantern hung near the ceiling, its glow softened by the color of the clay and the worn grain of the room. Steam curled upward from the pot, pale as breath on winter glass. He knelt beside the low table where the tools of tea waited. Each object, bowl, whisk, cloth, rested exactly where it belonged, untouched by hurry. His hands moved with a slow steadiness as he lifted the lid from the pot. A deeper cloud of steam rose, touching his face with a soft, fleeting warmth. Outside, bamboo shivered in a passing gust. He reached for a small scoop of leaves and let them fall gently into the bowl. Their scent escaped in thin, earthy notes, drifting just enough to tint the air. He poured the water without sound, watching its surface tremble slightly as it met the cooler clay. Ripples gathered along the inside of the bowl, spreading outward in a quiet rhythm. A faint creak sounded in the rafters as the wind shifted again. Shadows swayed across the walls like slow-moving silk. The monk whisked the tea with unhurried strokes, each movement light, each circle smooth and unbroken. Let tonight be simple. The room brightened for a moment as distant lightning brushed the sky, though no thunder followed. Only the sound of rain returned, tapping in steady lines along the tiles above. The monk lifted the bowl and held it close, watching the steam rise like a thin veil drifting upward, then fading into the lantern's glow. When he finally stood, the bowl warmed his hands. He slid the door open once more, letting the cool night enter in a quiet rush. Lantern light spilled across the threshold, where droplets clung to the edge of the floor like beads of glass. The monk stepped out, the tea resting carefully in his palms, and the shadow of the room behind him softened into stillness. The covered walkway opened to the night like a long wooden ribbon stretching beside the garden. Rain drummed softly on the roof above, collecting into thin streams that fell from the eaves in steady intervals. The air was cool enough to raise a small shiver along the monk's sleeves. He held the warm bowl close, letting its heat settle against his palms. Lanterns spaced along the walkway cast gentle pools of gold on the dark boards. Their light wavered as wind brushed the paper walls, bending and releasing them with small breaths. Beyond the railing, the garden shifted beneath the storm. Trees swaying, bamboo leaning, stones glistening in the wet glow. Mist hovered low to the ground, blurring the edges of everything. The monk stepped forward at an easy pace, each footfall quiet and deliberate. Rain gathered on the outer stones in shallow puddles, trembling with every new drop. A faint path of moonlight tried to push through the cloud cover, fragments of silver touching the surface of the pond in broken reflections. Somewhere behind the mountains, thunder moved gently without force. A distant bell carried through the valley again, its tones softened by wind and water. The walkway echoed it faintly, the sound stretching into subtle vibrations along the wooden beams. For a brief moment, the bowl in the monk's hands reflected the lanterns as wavering halos, gold dissolving into the surface of the tea. The wind shifted, sending a cool draft along the length of the corridor. The bamboo in the grove bowed deeper, their tops brushing together in soft murmurs. The lantern nearest the monk flickered, but did not dim, its flame leaning sideways in a long, delicate arc. The mind may rest now. As he continued walking, the scent of wet soil rose from the garden, fresh, dark, and familiar. Water clung to the stones in rounded beads, catching stray hints of light. Leaves, shaken loose by the storm, drifted across the walkway and came to rest near the wooden threshold. The monk paused to watch one of them swirl lightly before settling. Ahead of him, the path curved toward a small open space where the roof lifted higher, revealing more of the night sky. Mist drifted through the opening in thin patches, shifting like breath on cold glass. The lantern there glowed a little brighter than the others, casting a wide shimmer across the boards. The monk moved toward it slowly, the warm bowl steady in his hands, as the rain thickened its song all around him. The walkway opened toward a quiet corner of the garden, where a wooden bench waited beneath the shelter of a sloping roof. Rain filtered down in soft sheets just beyond the edge, falling into the pond with small, widening circles. The monk paused there, the warm bowl held gently between his palms, listening to the layered sounds of water on stone, water on leaves, water on water. The bench looked worn, its grain darkened by many seasons. He stepped nearer, letting the lantern light rest across his robes. The air was cool and filled with the scent of wet moss. Bamboo swayed nearby, their tall silhouettes bending and lifting again as the wind changed direction. A few late blossoms from a nearby tree had scattered onto the bench, pale petals resting lightly against the weathered wood. Beyond the bench, the pond rippled under the storm's touch. Each raindrop struck the surface and spread outward in soft, trembling rings. Fallen petals drifted along the edges, moving in and out of the shadows cast by the lantern above. A single koi flickered beneath the water, its color muted by the rain-stirred surface. The monk lowered himself carefully onto the bench, feeling the wood cool against his legs. He raised the bowl slightly, watching the steam curl upward in thin, wavering threads. The lantern light reflected on its surface, shifting gently with every breath of wind. Nothing around him hurried. Nothing pressed forward. Nothing leaned toward meaning. A faint rustle sounded behind the grove as a cluster of leaves loosened and fell, striking the ground with soft, broken taps. The wind moved again, passing through the bamboo like a slow exhale, bending them in a single graceful motion. Their shadows stretched across the pond, trembling slightly as droplets disturbed the water's mirror. Nothing is required from you. The monk lifted the bowl to his lips and took a slow sip. Warmth settled across his chest, gentle and unforced. The rain's rhythm steadied, finding a softer pattern against the wooden roof above. A firefly drifted near the lantern, its glow barely brighter than the flame inside, moving in loose circles before fading into the dim air. As the monk set the bowl down beside him, the pond responded with a brief shimmer, a small wave of light rolling across the surface as if touched by an unseen hand. The ripples carried themselves toward the far stones, dissolving into the rain. The monk watched them fade, his gaze resting on the quiet motion as mist rose slowly from the water's edge. A deeper wind moved through the valley, gathering itself from somewhere beyond the dark ridge. It reached the garden in a long, steady breath that set the bamboo swaying in slow unison. Their tall stalks bent gracefully, rising and falling like a quiet tide. The monk felt the shift before it touched him, a slight tremor in the air, a thinning of the warmth held in the folds of his robe. He lifted the tea bowl again, steadying it with both hands. The lantern above him flickered, its flame leaning hard to one side before recovering. Light rippled across the bench, stretching shadows in uneven patterns. A few petals lifted from the wood and drifted into the air, carried toward the pond before falling in soft spirals. Ripples expanded outward where they landed, merging with the storm's own circles. The wind reached the walkway with a cool sweep, brushing the monk's sleeves and stirring the edge of his robe. It carried the scent of wet stone and the faint sweetness of crushed leaves. Rain changed its rhythm, slanting sideways for a few breaths, before settling once more into its steady descent. The sound of water shifted across the roofs, finding new angles, new tones. The garden responded with rustles and whispers, branches bending, foliage trembling, droplets shaken loose. The pond darkened as clouds thickened overhead. Lightning, silent and distant, outlined the mountains for a brief moment, revealing their deep slopes before fading again. In that flash, the bamboo cast long shadows across the water, thin and wavering like brushstrokes on ink-wet paper. A moment later, everything softened back into muted night. The monk held the bowl close for warmth. The rising steam mingled with the wind, drifting sideways instead of up. Tiny droplets of rain blew beneath the roof's shelter, settling on his sleeves in cool specks. The wind pressed again, stronger this time, bending the bamboo into a low bow that creaked softly under the strain. The mind may rest now. A loose tile on the nearby roof clicked as the gust shifted direction. The lantern swung harder, its frame tapping a gentle rhythm against its hook. Light scattered across the walkway in restless patterns. The monk watched the lantern steady itself before it swayed again, never quite still, never overwhelmed. He rose from the bench, carrying the bowl with slow steps. The wind tugged at his robe, gathering it lightly before letting it fall. Leaves raced along the stones beside the pond, darting toward the shadows and vanishing. The air felt colder now, the storm drawing itself toward some quiet peak. The monk moved along the walkway, each step deliberate, each breath calm in the shifting night. As he rounded the corner toward the pavilion, a narrow beam of lantern light stretched across the boards, interrupted by the wind in trembling lines. The pond reflected only fragments now, patches of brightness broken by ripples, by falling rain, by the restless bamboo shadows. Mist rose thicker along the water's edge, stirred by the gusts into thin swirls that drifted across the path. He paused beneath another lantern, letting its dim glow rest over him. The flame inside fluttered fiercely for a moment, then softened. The monk lowered the tea bowl, watching the surface quiver with each breath of wind. Warm steam fled quickly into the air. Beyond him, a cluster of bamboo stalks leaned together, their tops brushing and parting as though exchanging quiet secrets. The garden's scent deepened, wet wood, earth newly turned by the storm, the faint mineral trace of stones washed clean. Rain continued its patterned descent, but changed with each shift of wind, now striking leaves, now rooftops, now the open ground with a slightly different tone. Nothing is required from you. The monk took another sip of tea. Warmth spread lightly across his chest, contrasting with the chill that swept along the walkway. Droplets gathered on the railing's edge, sliding down and falling in irregular beats into the pond. Each drop created a small flash of reflection before disappearing into the surface below. A sudden gust bent the bamboo sharply, leaves rattling like distant chimes. The lantern nearest the pavilion swung hard enough that its shadow raced across the boards. Steam lifted from the bowl in thin strands, the wind tugging it apart with quiet persistence. The monk stood very still, his gaze on the darkening sky where clouds thickened into a single deep mass. Thunder murmured faintly behind the mountains, softened by distance, more a breath than a sound. The wind eased for a moment, then returned with a gentler touch, cooling the boards beneath the monk's feet. Rain softened again, returning to its steady fall. In the brief calm, fireflies emerged from beneath the eaves, drifting through the lantern light in slow, wandering arcs. The pavilion waited just ahead, a shape of shadow and muted gold. A single candle glowed inside, protected behind a glass shield. Its flame barely moved in the draft, a small point of warmth against the night. The monk stepped closer, the tea bowl resting steady in his palms as a new gust passed through the bamboo with a long, bending sigh. At the edge of the pavilion roof, a single drop of water gathered, held its shape for a long moment, then released itself. It fell in a slow silver line before striking the stone below with a sound too soft to echo. The monk's eyes followed it, then lifted again to where the wind shaped the garden into shifting patterns of shadow and movement. Mist rose, swirling lightly near the pond, drifting between lantern light and darkness. The bench he had left behind was barely visible now, blurred by rain and wind, its outline softened into the night. The monk paused at the pavilion entrance, the storm breathing around him, bamboo bowing in the cool air. Ahead of him, the candle flickered once against the glass, casting a long, wavering reflection across the stone floor. The pavilion welcomed him with the soft echo of his steps crossing from wood to stone. Its roof caught the rain with a gentle, steady rhythm, each drop landing in quiet succession. The candle inside its glass shield offered a small, golden center to the dim space. Its flame stood almost still, trembling only when the wind pressed through the open sides of the structure. The tea bowl warmed the monk's hands as he walked toward the center. The stone floor felt cool beneath his feet, smooth from years of passing seasons. Rain blew in thin, diagonal lines through the open arches, scattering across the stones in tiny silver bursts. The monk set the bowl down upon a low wooden stand, watching the steam lift and mingle with the drifting mist. The scent of warm tea moved quietly through the air, faint but steady. Outside, the bamboo grove shifted with new restlessness. Their long shadows crossed the pond in wavering patterns, bending with each gust. Leaves fluttered free and danced briefly before settling. One brushed across the pavilion floor, carried by a gentle swirl of air before coming to rest near the candle. The monk glanced at it, then returned his gaze to the rain. The storm deepened its voice, but not its force. Rain thickened, falling in close-knit threads that blurred the garden into soft shades of gray and black. The lanterns beyond the walkway glowed like muted moons, halos expanding and contracting with each shift of wind. The candle flame near the monk leaned once, then returned to center. Let tonight be simple. He knelt beside the wooden stand, his posture steady. Drops collected on the pavilion's edge, sliding down and falling with soft taps that echoed lightly in the hollow space. The monk watched them fall, each drop a small, separate moment, striking stone and disappearing into the cool air. Mist crept along the ground, moving in loose, drifting waves. The roof above him creaked gently as another gust passed through. A line of water gathered along one beam, then released all at once, splashing onto the stone in a short, silver sheet. The sudden sound faded quickly, overtaken by the rain's steady rhythm. The monk's robe swayed slightly with the moving air, its edges brushing the stones in quiet strokes. He lifted the tea bowl again and held it near the candlelight. Steam rose in slender curves, bending softly before the draft pulled it sideways. The bowl reflected the flame in uneven shapes, a gold shimmer bending across its curved surface. Outside the pavilion, the garden's shapes dissolved further into a soft, shifting blur as the storm drew breath once more. The monk lowered the bowl, resting it gently upon the stand, Under the archway, rain fell in a curtain of silver threads, each drop catching a brief glint from the lanterns beyond. The bamboo bent toward one another as though listening. The pond rippled in layered circles that spread outward, touching the stones at its edges before fading into the rain. The candle flame flickered again against the glass, stretching briefly into a thin line before returning to its soft golden glow. A soft scuff of footsteps touched the walkway beyond the pavilion, so light it blended with the rhythm of the rain. The monk turned his head slightly, not startled, only aware. Through the drifting mist, a small figure approached, slow, careful steps along the wet boards. A village boy emerged from the shadows, holding a damp umbrella made of oiled paper, its ribs trembling gently in the wind. He paused at the edge of the pavilion, water dripping from the umbrella's tip in slow, rhythmic beads. His clothes clung to him in darkened folds, but his face held no urgency. He lowered his gaze in a hesitant bow. "Good evening," he murmured, the words barely above the sound of rain. The monk offered a simple nod and shifted slightly to make space beside him. The boy stepped onto the stone floor, closing the umbrella with a quick, practiced flick. Droplets scattered across the ground, catching faint glimmers of candlelight. He held the folded umbrella by his side and sat a short distance away, careful not to disturb the tea bowl resting on the wooden stand. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm filled the silence with its layered sounds. Rain on bamboo, rain on stone, rain sliding from the pavilion roof in wavering lines. The candle's glow fell gently across the boy's face, softening the angles of his expression. His breaths slowed, settling into the same quiet rhythm as the monk's. Wind pushed through the open arches, stirring their robes and bending the flame within the glass. Outside, a stronger gust bent the bamboo until they nearly touched the ground. Leaves rattled with a hollow, delicate chime. The boy's hands opened on his knees, his fingers uncurling, releasing the tension of his walk through the storm. "You are safe here." He glanced at the monk briefly, then turned his gaze toward the garden. "The path was darker tonight," he said, voice steady but soft. It was his final line. He spoke no more. The monk offered only a small nod, neither agreeing nor questioning, letting the words drift away like steam dissolving into cool air. The boy watched the pond as circles formed and faded across its surface. Lantern light trembled along the walkway, reflected in broken pieces on the water. Mist rose in gentle waves, drifting around the pavilion's columns. The storm shifted again, not stronger, not weaker, simply moving in its own rhythm, its own unhurried shape. A firefly drifted in from the garden, crossing between candle and darkness. Its glow flickered once, briefly mirroring the candle's faint pulse. Then it floated out toward the rain, its tiny light swallowed by the night. Rain thickened for a brief moment, a soft rush sweeping across the garden as if the storm were gathering itself again. The boy shifted slightly on the stone floor, his eyes fixed on the pond where the lantern reflections broke and reformed in unsteady fragments. The monk lifted the tea bowl, offering it to the air but not yet drinking. Steam drifted upward, its thin threads bending with every quiet breath of wind. The boy lifted a hand and pointed toward the water. In the dim light, small circles appeared, one, then another, as raindrops touched the pond in delicate rhythms. Each circle widened, overlapped, and dissolved into the next. The monk followed the gesture without speaking, his gaze steady and unhurried. Mist drifted across the surface, rising like breath from a sleeping animal. The pavilion's candle cast a soft glow along the stone, its reflection trembling in the bowl the monk held. The flame wavered within its glass shield, never extinguishing, always returning to center. The boy lowered his hand again, letting it rest loosely atop his knees. The sound of water filled the quiet between them, unbroken and without urgency. "Let tonight be simple." A breeze crept through the pavilion, stirring the edges of their clothes. The boy's umbrella, resting beside him, shifted slightly and tapped the stone with a muted knock. Outside, the bamboo grove swayed with a soft, heavy rhythm, bending under the weight of the wind. Their shadows crossed the pond in dark, wavering strokes. The monk took a slow sip from the bowl. Warmth drifted through him without force. He set the bowl back on the stand, watching a thin ribbon of steam curl along the rim before fading. The boy leaned forward just slightly, eyes drawn to the soft glow of the candle, the way it touched the edges of the pavilion posts. Lightning flickered far behind the mountains, faint and without sound. For a moment the entire garden appeared in a washed, pale silhouette, trees bowed, pond shimmering, mist lifting in ghost-like curls. Then darkness folded gently back into place, calming everything into soft shapes once more. A fallen leaf skittered across the stone floor, caught by a wandering gust. It slid toward the pond's edge before dropping out of sight. The boy's breath left his chest in a slow, visible fog before dissolving into the night. Neither he nor the monk reached for words. The storm spoke enough. The candle's flame bent once more, stretching into a thin line as wind brushed past the open arch. Its long reflection wavered across the stone, trembling at the edge of shadow. Along the outer walkway, the lanterns swayed with the changing wind, each one shifting between bright and dim as clouds thickened overhead. Their glow stretched across the wet boards, forming long, uneven stripes of gold that trembled with every gust. Rain continued its quiet fall, threading through the night in steady, silvery lines. The storm held no rush, only its calm persistence. The monk and the boy stepped from the pavilion, moving toward the lantern-lit path. Mist drifted low around their feet, stirred by their passing. The tea bowl rested once more in the monk's hands, its surface faintly warm. The boy walked at his side without a word, his closed umbrella tapping lightly against his leg with each step. The lanterns ahead flickered again, their flames bowing to the breath of the wind. One dimmed almost to darkness before rising slowly back to life, glowing with a soft resilience. Shadows from the wooden pillars stretched long across the walkway, sliding gently as the light shifted from lantern to lantern. Rain tapped rhythmically along the roof above, drops gathering at the edges before falling in thin, slanted threads. Beyond the railing, the garden blurred into deep shades of charcoal and muted silver. Bamboo swayed in slow arcs, their tops brushing one another with soft, hollow murmurs. Each motion cast new shadows across the stones, wavering like strokes of ink moving across damp paper. The pond shimmered faintly through the shifting mist, its surface broken by rain rings that spread and vanished without hurry. A lantern near the center of the path flared brighter as a gust swept through, its paper walls glowing with sudden warmth. The boy paused to look, the light reflecting in dim fragments across his damp sleeves. His breath drifted into the cool air, dissolving in a pale cloud. The monk stood beside him, the bowl steady in his hands, their silhouettes softened by the drifting mist. "Nothing is required from you," thunder murmured somewhere far behind the mountains, a low, distant pulse that settled quickly back into silence. The lanterns swayed in gentle response, their light rippling across the walkway like small waves moving over dark water. A loose leaf glided along the boards before settling near a puddle, where it floated softly at the edge. As they continued walking, the reflections of the lanterns shimmered in the thin sheets of water collected on the boards. Light fractured into slender lines beneath their feet, breaking apart with each step, forming again behind them. The rain softened even more, falling so lightly that it resembled drifting sand. The walkway ahead glowed in layers, dark wood, shifting reflections, trembling shadows. At the far end of the path, another lantern flickered, its light barely holding against the wind. It cast a thin reflection across the soaked boards, stretched long and wavering, reaching toward them like a luminous thread slowly unraveling in the night. The wind eased as they reached the far stretch of the walkway, leaving the lanterns to steady themselves one by one. Their glow settled into gentle pools of light, softening the outlines of the posts and railings. Rain thinned to a fine mist, drifting rather than falling. The monk paused beneath one lantern whose flame bowed lightly within its frame. The boy stopped beside him, his umbrella resting loosely in his hand. For a moment, they simply stood there, sharing the same quiet space. The garden breathed around them, bamboo bending with softened motion, pond rippling in faint, overlapping circles. The candlelight from the pavilion behind them cast a dim glow across the wet boards, stretching out in a long reflection that trembled with each passing breeze. The boy looked toward the open path that led back to the village, its stones glistening with thin sheets of water. He bowed his head gently. "Thank you," he whispered, the words drifting barely louder than the rain. The monk returned the gesture with a nod, offering no reply. The boy lifted his umbrella and opened it with a small, practiced motion. The oiled paper canopy spread with a muted crackle, catching a few scattered droplets from the air. He stepped off the walkway and onto the garden path, the lantern light falling softly over his shoulders. The mist thickened around him, rising in low swirls that brushed against his legs. As he walked, the umbrella tilted in the shifting wind, its edges trembling with each gust. His figure grew fainter with every few steps, swallowed, piece by piece, by the drifting veils of night. The monk watched without moving, the tea bowl warm between his hands. A distant lantern flickered briefly as the boy passed near it, casting a thin ribbon of gold across the stones. The path curved, and his silhouette blurred further, umbrella first, then shoulders, then the faint shape of his head. Mist closed behind him, leaving only the soft sound of wet footsteps fading into the storm's rhythm. When the monk finally lowered his gaze, the walkway felt wider in the boy's absence. The candle in the pavilion behind him steadied, its glow reaching softly across the boards. Rain tapped gently on the umbrella left in the boy's wake, dropping from the eaves in slow, measured lines. A single leaf slid along the path, carried by a stray gust before settling near a puddle. The monk lifted the bowl toward his chest, feeling its warmth seep through the cool night air. He stepped back toward the pavilion, where the candle's small flame shone through its glass with a quiet resilience. Larger droplets fell from the roof's edge, splashing softly onto the stones below. The lantern above him swayed once, casting its reflection in a trembling trail across the wet boards. He paused beneath it, eyes lowering toward the faint shimmer of light rippling through the water gathered along the walkway, uneven, shifting, never still. Thunder rolled gently behind the mountains, a long, low breath that never broke into force. The sky above the temple deepened into a heavy slate, clouds layered so thickly they hid even the faintest trace of the moon. Rain gathered strength again, falling in close-knit threads that wove the night into a curtain of moving silver. The monk stepped back beneath the pavilion's shelter, the bowl warm against his palms. The candle inside its glass shield flickered under a brief gust, stretching thin before returning to its steady flame. Drops swept across the open arches in diagonal lines, some striking the stone and scattering into tiny starbursts. The monk lowered himself to sit on the cool floor, robes settling softly around him. Outside, the bamboo grove leaned in deep arcs, their shapes swaying like slow, breathing creatures. A stronger pulse of wind passed through the valley, bending the bamboo until their tops brushed one another with a hollow rattle. Rain drummed hard against the roof, its rhythm swelling into a layered cadence, fast on the tiles, slower along the wooden edges, soft where it met the pond. Mist lifted from the garden floor, caught and reshaped by every shift of air. The mind may rest now. Lightning flickered far behind the ridge, illuminating the clouds from within. For a heartbeat, the garden appeared in a pale wash. Stones brightened, branches outlined, the pond shining as if lit from beneath. Then the darkness returned, gentler than before, folding itself around every shape. The monk watched the sky without expectation, his breathing even and unhurried. The tea bowl's surface trembled as the wind nudged the pavilion. Steam drifted sideways, dissolving before it reached the open air. A thin thread of water slid from the roof, gathering at one point before releasing in a continuous drop into a shallow puddle on the stone floor. Each impact made a tiny ripple that spread outward in slow, imperfect circles. Shadows from the lanterns along the walkway stretched and contracted with every gust. Their glow struggled against the dark, but never disappeared, each flame bending, recovering, bending again. The boards glistened under the shifting reflections, long streaks of gold trembling across the wet surface. Farther out, the garden had blurred into a single, softened silhouette, its edges lost to rain and mist. Thunder murmured once more, deeper this time, though still gentle. The bamboo answered with a long, swaying motion, their leaves shaking loose droplets that pattered softly onto the stones. The pond moved with the storm, circles upon circles, ripples overlapping until the entire surface shimmered like woven cloth. The monk observed it with stillness, letting the night carry itself forward without any need for meaning. A heavy gust pressed against the pavilion again, tilting the candle flame in a long bow. Its reflection stretched across the stone in a wavering line, trembling at the edge of shadow. The storm began to loosen its hold on the valley, though no clear boundary marked the change. Rain softened in slow stages, its threads thinning until they resembled drifting mist more than falling water. The bamboo, once bent in deep arcs, lifted gently back into place, their leaves shaking out the last clinging droplets. In the pavilion, the monk lifted the tea bowl, now only faintly warm, and held it with calm, steady hands. A quiet spread across the garden, not silence, but a gentler layering of sound. Water continued to fall from the eaves in spaced droplets. The pond shifted less violently, its surface forming broader, calmer rings. Wind moved only in brief breaths, enough to sway the candle flame but not enough to bend it fully. Mist rose in thin ribbons from the ground, flowing around stones in slow, wandering paths. A fragment of moonlight pushed through a thinning seam in the clouds. It brushed the pond in a pale band, revealing the faint outline of drifting petals. Lanterns along the walkway glowed more evenly now, their light no longer pressed flat by the storm. Each one cast a small pool of gold upon the boards, its reflection trembling but unbroken. Let tonight be simple. The monk set the bowl down and rose to his feet, stepping closer to the pavilion's open arch. Cool air met him, carrying the scent of soaked earth and distant pine. Drops continued to fall from the bamboo, each one a soft tap among the broader quiet. The storm had not vanished. It had only grown tired, its force easing into gentle remnants. Farther along the walkway, a lone lantern swayed once, then steadied. Its small circle of light revealed shallow puddles gathering between the boards, their surfaces rippling as the last few drops touched them. A firefly drifted into the glow, its soft light pulsing once before it rose into the damp air. The monk followed its path until it disappeared into the thinning mist. The garden regained its shape slowly. Stones emerged from shadow, their edges defined once more. The curve of the pond became clear, its surface dark but calmer than before. Bamboo reflected faintly in the water, their tall forms doubled in wavering silhouettes. The lingering rain traced gentle lines across these reflections, breaking them in soft, shifting patterns. A faint sound echoed from the valley. No thunder now, only the distant rush of water moving through hidden channels. The monk watched as a final gust passed through the garden, stirring the mist along the ground. It lifted, twisted once around a stone, and drifted out over the pond in a long, dissolving veil. The candle within the pavilion glowed steadily through its glass, its reflection stretching thinly across the stone floor, trembling at the farthest edge of shadow. The storm's remnants thinned further as night softened toward morning. A faint, pale glow gathered behind the mountain ridge, spreading slowly like watercolor on wet paper. The sky held to its darkness for a while longer, but the first suggestion of dawn pressed gently upward. The monk stepped from the pavilion onto the wooden walkway, the boards cool beneath his feet. Mist clung low along the ground, drifting in slow, measured waves. Lanterns burned steadily now, their flames calm and round within their paper frames. Their light mixed with the early gray of the coming day, forming quiet gradients along the walkway. Puddles on the boards reflected these tones in trembling shapes, broken whenever a final few drops of rain slid from the roof. The monk moved with easy steps, carrying the empty tea bowl close to his chest. The bamboo grove stood taller in the easing wind. Their dark silhouettes swayed in gentler arcs than before, shedding the last droplets that clung to their leaves. Each drop fell with a faint, spaced tap that echoed softly across the garden. The pond mirrored the grove's movement, its ripples fewer now, its surface calming into a dark, glassy stillness. Nothing is required from you. As the monk walked, the light behind the ridge grew stronger, brushing the clouds with a muted rose. Birds began to stir within the bamboo, small rustles, soft calls, the faint buzz of wings waking. Their sounds blended seamlessly into the lingering hush of the night, neither breaking it nor filling it, only becoming part of it. The monk paused to watch a thin ribbon of mist drift across the pond, dissolving at its edges. He shifted the bowl to one hand and lifted the other to adjust his robe. Night's chill lingered in the fabric, but a gentle warmth approached with the first breath of dawn. The walkway ahead curved toward the inner temple, where lanterns still cast soft circles against the paper walls. Footsteps from earlier had faded entirely, leaving the boards marked only by thin reflections. The monk passed beneath a final lantern, its glow paling slightly as the sky brightened. The flames swayed once, bowing to a light breeze that moved along the corridor. In the air lingered the scent of rain-soaked cedar, clean and deep, rising from the beams and floorboards. The bowl in his hands reflected the lantern's dimming light in a faint, wavering line. At the entrance to the corridor, he paused again. The first true rays of dawn touched the rooftops, coloring the wet tiles with a soft sheen. Mist curled upward where the stone still held the night's cold, lifting into thin, ghost-like shapes before vanishing. The monk stood in the quiet, his breath moving slowly, as the day prepared to unfold beyond the last traces of the storm. A final breeze slipped through the garden, shifting the bamboo into a gentle, unified sway. Their shadows stretched long across the pond, trembling lightly at the edges. The corridor met him with its familiar dimness, lanterns burning low along the walls. Their light had softened into warm, muted pools, each one surrounded by pale halos where the paper thinned with age. The monk stepped inside, his bare feet touching the cool boards with barely a sound. The air held the deep scent of wet cedar, rising gently from beams and floor alike. Raindrops continued to fall in slow intervals from the roofs outside, striking stone basins with soft, echoing taps. Each drop sent small ripples outward before fading. The monk moved down the corridor with unhurried steps, the empty bowl resting against his palms. Shadows followed at his side, lengthened by the dying lantern flames, shifting with each motion he made. The storm's remnants whispered through the cracks in the old wood, a faint, passing breath. Thin drafts brushed the fabric of his robe as he walked, lifting its edges just enough to stir the air behind him. Along the paper windows, droplets clung like beads of glass, catching the lantern light in dull glimmers. Beyond them, the garden had faded into a pale gray, shaped only by the earliest hints of dawn. Let tonight be simple. He passed a section of the corridor where the boards dipped slightly, worn smooth by countless steps. His foot pressed gently into the hollow, the sound soft and familiar. A lantern above flickered once, bowing its flame toward the floor before correcting itself. Its glow reached across the walkway in a thin strip, lighting the bowl in his hands with a faint shimmer. Farther ahead, the corridor narrowed. The monk slowed, letting the silence deepen around him. The last of the rain slid from the eaves in a quiet stream, tapping steadily into the stone gutters. Mist drifted past the windows in faint wisps, rising and falling with each shift of the morning air. The scent of wet earth slipped into the hall, subtle and cool. A lone moth circled one of the lanterns, wings brushing the paper in slow, uncertain taps. Its shadow fluttered across the wall in faint, trembling shapes. The monk paused to watch, his breathing even, the bowl held loosely now. Nothing is required from you. As he resumed his steps, the lantern behind him dimmed further, its flame shrinking into a small, glowing ember. The corridor ahead seemed to gather the soft light of dawn, its far end brightening just slightly as morning pressed closer. The monk walked toward that pale glow, leaving behind the echoes of the night's storm. Through the doorway to his room waited at the far end of the corridor, its wooden frame touched by the faintest glow of dawn. The monk approached it with slow, measured steps, the empty tea bowl warming slightly in his palms from the lingering heat of his hands. The lantern beside the door burned low, its flame no more than a soft, golden point within the paper shell. The air held the last traces of night, cool, damp, and quiet. He paused beneath the lantern, letting its dim light fall across his robe. Beyond the open door, the room lay in gentle shadow, its simple shapes waiting in stillness. A folded mat, a low wooden chest, a single cushion near the window. The faint outline of the garden could be seen through the paper screen, the world outside softened into pale gray by the dawn. The monk stood without moving, listening to the corridor settle behind him. A final drop of water slipped from the roof's edge outside, falling with a delicate tap into the stone basin below. The sound echoed faintly through the hall, softer than before, as if signaling the storm's last whisper. The bowl in his hands reflected the lantern's glow in a thin, trembling curve. The monk breathed slowly, feeling the cool air shift around him as the temple settled into the early calm. "You are safe here." Wind drifted through the corridor in a gentle wave, moving the edge of his robe. It carried the scent of wet wood and the faint trace of distant pine. The lantern flickered once, stretching its small flame into a narrow line before it regained its round glow. Shadows wavered along the walls, stretching and folding in soft, unhurried motion. The monk lowered his gaze to the mat inside the room. Its woven surface caught a sliver of dawn's first light, a thin silver edge along the floor. He stepped forward, but did not yet cross the threshold, letting the moment settle without urge or intention. The bowl rested quietly against his palms, cool now, as the last warmth faded into the air. From somewhere outside, a bird called once, short, soft, and uninsistent. The sound drifted through the open window, touching the stillness without disturbing it. Mist rose in slow curls along the temple eaves, catching the morning light in pale, wavering strands. The monk let his breath match the quiet rhythm of these movements, steady and calm. A final breeze slipped through the corridor, moving the lantern flame in a gentle bow. Its reflection trembled across the floorboards, stretching toward the open doorway where morning waited, soft and unresolved.